Migration dominated headlines in the UK this summer. Small boats crossing the channel, protests outside hotels, housing asylum seekers, and the government's one-in, one-out agreement with France. But those headlines also gloss over a number of contradictions. More than 30,000 people have crossed the channel in small boats this year, and yet by far the highest number of people arriving in the country are students. Recent surveys show increasing public unease about the scale of migration, and yet net migration is falling. It's also striking that these days the media tends to talk about all new arrivals as migrants rather than refugees or asylum seekers, or maybe just people. So how much is media coverage contributing to the heat and division? And how much is it simply reflecting public attitudes? Well, with me to discuss the role of the media are Duna Haj Ahmed, who's a Syrian journalist and refugee, Andrew Harding, the BBC's Paris correspondent, who's reported extensively on small boats and the smuggling gangs, Nicola Kelly, a journalist and writer. She's formerly worked at the Home Office, and her book, Anywhere But Here, How Britain's Broken Asylum System Fails Us All, came out this year. And Rob McNeill, who's the Deputy Director of Oxford University's Migration Observatory. Welcome to you all. Really, really pleased to have you here. I want to begin by asking each of you the same question, which is, what event or story relating to migration has made the biggest impression on you? Rob, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Thank you. So I had two, but I've got to keep it to one just for this. So the thing that really has always stood out to me is something that happened when I was in the early days of my life as a journalist, when I was working, I think, for the Evening Standard at the time, and it was the closure of the Songat refugee camp, which, for those of you who don't know or don't remember this, the Songat refugee camp was built, I think, by the Red Cross, and was housing people primarily from, I think, sort of parts of Eastern Europe, who were trying to reach the UK in the late 1990s. And there was a lot of media discourse about this at the time, about the fact that it had been built very, very close to the Eurostar tunnel, and that this was perceived to be an extremely cynical ploy on the part of the French government to basically offload asylum seekers by providing them with easy access to the Eurostar tunnel, and therefore they were naturally going to sort of hop off and go to the UK instead. And I, having been not at all experienced or interested in the issue of migration, particularly at that point in time, was inculcated into this sort of narrative as much as anybody else was. And I had a conversation with my brother, who was living in Paris, who still does live in Paris, who obviously reads the French media. And I asked him, and I sort of just parroted out what I'd heard. I basically said, how can the French government be so cynical about this? It's such a shocking thing to do. And my brother said something which fundamentally shifted my understanding of the issue, which was, Rob, the refugee camp's not there because they're trying to offload the refugees. The refugee camp is there because that's where the refugees are. And if it wasn't there, they'd be sleeping in the fields. And that was something that made me realise just the role that media has played in my understanding of the issue. And then obviously what subsequently happened is that the closure of Songat led to a series of things, including the
refugees sleeping in the fields.
Exactly that, refugees sleeping in the fields, the Calais jungle, and it demonstrated something that is still an issue now, which is that basically by dealing with one problem, in inverted commas, as with a simplistic solution presented to us by media and policy a media and policy solution, all that ended up happening was that the problem was moved. So right. The next thing that happened was people in the backs of trucks using the port of Calais, massive investment in the port of Calais, in securitizing that, then led to essentially what we have now, which is people then using another approach, which is small boats. And that's where we've got
unintended consequences.
Precisely.
Duna, yours is a very personal story, so let's hear from you.
Thank you so much. So, actually, one of the stories that struck me the most, I've been telling you about this story. Anybody who lives in the UK, whether you are British or just living in the UK, you know how much time it takes the Home Office and institution known for its slowness in taking any decision and making any decision. So the Syrian regime, I don't know if you follow up with the Syrian context, the Syrian regime has fallen, Assad regime in Syria in December 2024. So in less than 24 hours, the Home Office announced that all Syrian-related things will be suspended. So it took them less than 24 hours and putting thousands of lives on limbo. It's been more than 1 year now, and the Home Office is still working on the Syria policy, and it's stopping lives of thousands of people.
And what does it mean for you?
Actually, it's just shocking because I've been treated in Syria with Assad regime, and that's why I'm here, because I couldn't go back to my country at that time, because I've been treated as a figure. All the time I felt that I'm not a human, I'm a figure for Assad regime in Syria. I just felt the same. I came to study human rights in the UK, and it shocked me so much. Like, I came to study human rights, I'm a human. So it's very shocking that you're working all the time just to prove that you're a human.
But just to be clear, your legal status is now in limbo.
Yeah, of course. Everything is in limbo. Just like thousands of people.
Nicola.
I've heard lots of heartbreaking stories over the last 7+ years that I've been reporting on this issue. But one that really sticks out to me is the story of my friend Tawfiq Hussain, a really principled, brave, brilliant immigration solicitor who in 2020 was visited at his office by a self-proclaimed neo-Nazi. In this man's bag, the perpetrator's bag, was a machete, some handcuffs and a swastika flag. And he intended to murder Tawfiq in front of his colleagues in broad daylight and then put the swastika flag up in the window of the offices. I think what really struck me about it, obviously it's really shocking in the detail, but was the fact that there's such a direct line between the rhetoric and the reality, because just days before, the Home Secretary at the time, Priti Patel, had said that activist lawyers, or so-called lefty lawyers, were to blame for frustrating removals of failed asylum seekers. And then days later, that was carried in the Daily Mail alongside Tawfiq's name and a picture of his office. And days later, Kevin Medlock, the perpetrator of this act, was arrested, and he's been sentenced to life imprisonment. But that story really, really remains with me in terms of just the targeting, the politicization of this issue, but the targeting of people working on the front line.
So much there to unpack, and I hope we'll talk about. Andrew, what about for you?
That's a hard one to follow. Let me maybe lighten the mood slightly. My story starts sadly. Last April, 17 months ago, I was on a beach south of Calais. I saw a boat getting into trouble. 5 people were essentially trampled to death inside a small boat, including a 7-year-old girl called Sarah. But fast forward 17 months, and just a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in a 14-year-old girl's room in an apartment near Lille in northern France. And this girl is called Rahaf, and she's a remarkable young woman. Her first language is Swedish. Her second language is Arabic. Her third language is English. And she just spent the summer holidays with this notebook that she was showing me, in which she has painstakingly written out everything she knows in Swedish. Then she translates it online and then writes it out in French, because she was preparing to start her first term at the local school in a town, as I was saying, near Lille. Rahaf is the older sister of Sarah, who died. And Rahaf is an extraordinary woman, as I say, a young girl. Her determination had always been to get to England. That's where she has family. But I asked her, do you feel French now? And she said, not yet, but I intend to become French. And she's taking that very seriously. And I said, how have things changed? And she said, well, it's very noisy here now. And the reason for the noise is that her parents, who've been, in a terrible straits for the last year, having lost their youngest daughter, they've just had a new baby daughter born, well, it was 12 days ago when I saw her. And they were going to call her Sarah as well. In fact, that's what Rahaf wanted to call her, but her mum, Noor, intervened and came up with Sally, which sort of has echoes, but I think she didn't want to have her the same name for the daughter. But anyway, that's what sticks with me now, and it's a sort of upbeat story.
Resilience and
resilience,
hope in that
yes.
story, yes.
Yeah.
Right, so let's try and get a picture, at least, about what we're describing here. Rob, very briefly, small boats have had all the attention this summer, But what's the scale of the problem, and is the coverage disproportionate, or does it reflect the cost?
I mean, that's a difficult thing to answer because it's fundamentally subjective. I mean, what matters to people, right? Now, I think that
But what are the numbers? Okay, let's just start with the numbers. How many people have we seen coming over in small boats, and what is that compared to overall migration?
Okay, I mean, so if I recall correctly, and I'm sure that other people might actually have the stats more easily to hand than me, but I think it's about 36,000 this year, which is heading towards record numbers for the year. And the last time we were anywhere close to this was 2022, when we had a big spike in people coming from Albania in particular, which massively inflated the figures. It's a small share. I mean, it's a very small share of overall migration. I mean, I think it's definitely well below 10% of it's 5%. I mean, it fluctuates. I'm supposed to be the one with the stats. I didn't prep all of this. I didn't know that I was going to be asked this, so I would have had them to hand if I had done. But the cost, the actual cost to the exchequer of people coming and claiming asylum is considerably higher than, for example, the cost of people coming and working and
because essentially you're paying for them to stay in hotels.
But also because we have policy which precludes people from working, it precludes people from staying in the accommodation that they might want to find with and pay for with a job. So it's not straightforwardly, it's just expensive. It's expensive because of policy. That policy is designed to deter people. This deterrence process is fundamental to a lot of government thinking and has been for quite a long time, but it can massively increase costs, and that also massively increases people's concerns about the issue. So, to sort of clarify whether it's proportionate, whether the degree of coverage is proportionate, is hard to say.
Okay.
It's a big deal. It's very expensive. It's much more expensive than other components. And it is potentially something that is of extremely great importance. Overall numbers, net migration, is only significant if people are worried about population growth, right?
Andrew, you're covering the small boat story. You're there on the beaches as you described. What role do you think you're playing as a reporter, as a BBC reporter?
People have a lot of questions. People are because we're an island nation, I think. The French certainly don't care particularly about what's going along the northern coast unless they happen to live along the beaches and see the police and see the bodies wash up. And then they get, understandably, very concerned. But generally, this is something that I think, for a variety of reasons, people in Britain, and I get lots of emails and lots of questions, people are baffled by, for a start. They can't understand why we can't stop it. There's a profound sense of unfairness that some people feel. Why are these people jumping the queue? Why, with a military, with a navy, if these people are breaking the law, why can't we stop that? And so that's something that we look at, we examine, we try and explain the legal issues surrounding that. I think it also touches deeply on people, on two sort of very strong emotional things. One is people's sense of pity. People see these people in misery often, determined, sometimes desperate, and they want to help. But there's also that other very strong and I think very motivating factor, which is that sense of unfairness, that somehow these people are cheating, that they're getting ahead and they're being put up in hotels. So the way I try and cover it is by basically spending an awful lot of time, an awful lot of nights along the coast, trying to understand what's going on fundamentally. Who are these people? Why do they not want to stay in France? Why do they want to get to England? Who's trying to stop them? Why the French police are often unable to stop them? Who are the smugglers? Is this an issue of trafficking or is it not? Basic questions, and then trying to basically answer those questions all over again, because with news, you have to keep repeating because obviously you're not reaching everybody with each story. And there is just, I think, an inbuilt fascination, maybe particularly because we're an island.
Nicola, when you pitch stories, when you think about what to cover, Andrew's described a really broad spread of ideas and issues to raise. How receptive are people to that? And how does that coverage perhaps contrast with what the politicians are telling us?
Editors admit actually sometimes that they are quite fatigued by this issue. It is in our headlines, it's in our news bulletins, it's in our papers every single day. It was the same situation in 2015 with the so-called Syrian refugee crisis. I think where people's stories are concerned, those are the stories that need to be really brought to the fore, because at the moment it's political correspondents who are covering this issue. And actually there are no specialist correspondents. There isn't a single immigration report. There isn't a single migration correspondent in any news outlet, not even progressive ones. And those are the stories, like the ones Andrew's describing. There is a dearth of coverage involving human stories, those human voices, and that's what I think we really need. It's difficult to get editors' ears on that. I'm a freelancer, so I work with lots of different editors and lots of different outlets. And yeah, you get cut through eventually, but I think there definitely needs to be more emphasis on people's stories.
And you alluded to the questions of language, and so did I. Do you ever get, how should I describe it, shepherded to use particular language or to avoid particular language?
I'm really careful with use of language because I think language really matters on this issue. You said in your introductory remarks, I think using people rather than asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, describing what people are, which is people, a man, a woman, children, humanizes them and sort of shortens that distance between the audience and the reporter. And I think that's incredibly important to humanize people.
Do you know what's been your reaction? How have you felt, is the question that I really want to ask, as you've watched the stories and the language that they're couched in, the idea of a flood or a wave, or what does it feel like for you, and what's your reaction to it?
Yeah, so for me, actually, I'm a journalist, a human rights activist. I'm a human after all. So watching myself being portrayed on media as a burden, as a flood, as a wave, and the pictures and how the media portrays us, it's just like dehumanized. Like I feel that this is just taking my humanization out of me. They are dehumanized us. So I rarely say anything about the contributions, the resilience. I carry the resilience experience. I came from Syria. I carry the contributions of my country. I carry everything with me. So it's not only like a wave or crowded and that. Like I've been contributing to society just as much as any citizen living in this country. I rarely see anything of this taken or actually arriving to the front page. And seeing myself being put as statistic or figure, it's just like dehumanization, which I was not expecting to find in a country. I came to study human rights. I remember myself when I chose to study in the UK, I read about the Magna Carta, and I was like, oh my God, like this is the country that created the human rights. So I've been treated like, I've been asked all the time, how come I'm white, I'm Muslim? So it shocked me so much that nobody knows anything about us, and even like if you don't know anything, you just go educate yourself, Google it. So it was very shocking to see yourself being treated as a figure. And as I told you, in Syria, we started the revolution, and I participated in the revolution from the very beginning. I was chanting for freedom in the streets of Syria, and at that moment, I always describe it as the first time in my whole life, I felt that I'm really breathing. And I'm really not exaggerating in saying that I felt that I'm breathing. I'm saying freedom, and I came to maybe carry the voices of people in Syria who couldn't make it, of my friends who couldn't make it to this point. So being treated as a figure is just like dehumanization.
Nicola, one more point on language before we move on, which is relevant to Duna's experience. You worked in the Home Office. To what extent do you think some of the perhaps less palatable language actually emanates from the Home Office?
Yeah, I mean, we see it with language like swarms, invasion. Yeah, I mean, it's deliberate in many cases. There are times I sort of hang my head in shame because we had to write this messaging for ministers, for the Home Secretary sometimes, talking points. I wouldn't have written that wouldn't use that particular rhetoric. But yeah, I think there's an interesting question to answer about the ways that journalists kind of perpetuate that language as well, because we have to report what politicians are saying, but yes, it's tricky to sort of work around that language when you know that it's not accurate, when you know that it's incredibly inflammatory and may well lead to far-right attacks on, for example, asylum hotels, as we saw this summer.
Can I do a shameless
yes.
plug? Sorry. So if you're interested, the NCTJ free course on reporting migration, which I wrote, has a good glossary of terminology that is sort of recommended. So I would strongly point people towards that.
So I think we're really getting to the heart of the idea that this is a really complex subject, and actually there is nuance, but are we hearing all the nuance? Duna, do you think that we hear enough from people who are actually affected, as in a way Nicola has been describing? Are those stories of real people highlighted enough for you?
I don't think so, because I always feel that migrants and refugees are talking about and not talking to, so they are not part of the story. They are always described. They are not brought to the discussion. So everything is just like made for them, so they don't talk about their contributions, they don't talk about their resilience, their stories. They dehumanize them to the extent that you just think about them as we said, a wave, or like a picture for some like overcrowded boats, which will just amplify more fear, more more fear in people who are watching those kinds of pictures. And the media has the key to change this picture, to portray. For example, we've seen the picture of Alan al-Kurdi, the Syrian child who died on the boats of Europe, and maybe in just this picture, all people, or actually Europe, just woke up to the cost of migration, and then just like they woke up for some days and then they forgot, and then they came back to the overcrowd, and they came back to people in the overcrowded hotels as well. So I don't think so, simply because migrants and refugees, they are not part of the conversation. They are just like, we talk about them and we don't bring their experience.
Andrew, despite BBC News' best efforts, it is not a monolith. There are many different people with many different ideas trying to commission very specifically and in often very creative ways. But do you feel that there is still room for nuance, given budget pressures, the fact that everybody's working harder, teams are smaller, and also, do you get a sense of who's driving the agenda, whether it's actually newsrooms or perhaps politicians?
I try and drive my own agenda, really, and I've been given a lot of leeway and a lot of support and a lot of time to do investigations. Although, we were talking about the language, what I worry sometimes about is I'll spend months investigating a gang. Keir Starmer will then go, see, we've arrested somebody in Birmingham, stop the gangs and we'll fix this problem. And you're thinking, no, the gangs are not the problem. The gangs are part of the problem, but they're simply supplying a service to people who want to get across and can find no other way.
But just tell us the story, because that actually happened, didn't it, Andrew?
So this was actually in the run-up to a summit between Macron and Starmer, and we happened to be on a beach one morning, and we'd been waiting on that beach for many nights because it was a beach that was being used by a particular gang that we were following and trying to understand how it worked. And it so happened that morning some French gendarmes saw a boat coming close to the shore. Its propeller they were trying to start the propeller. There was a young girl close to the propeller. It was clearly very dangerous. And the police intervened. They went in, as they so rarely do, sliced the boat, and the people got out safely. It was fascinating to see how the French government made no comment. They said, well, we have a summit coming up, so we're not going to talk about that. Immediately, Number 10 span it as, look, this is the French making greater efforts, changing their policy, being more aggressive, which actually turned out not to be the case. I mean, the French are refining the way they try to stop the boats, but it's a long, slow, very bureaucratic negotiation, and it does not involve more intervention from the beaches. It may involve more interventions in shallow waters from patrol boats. But yes, so the language is, and the way the language is used, and the way we choose to focus on gangs at times, I think, well, probably we've done enough on gangs. We spend a lot of time talking to migrants, and the thing I always try and do in self-police is that I don't use words like desperate. I don't try and apportion motives to people. I try and let them speak for themselves. I know that doesn't always come across. There's a lot of coverage that speaks over the heads of those people crossing. But something that the message that came very clearly from my bosses when I got this job was help to humanize these people. For better or worse, whether we think what they're doing is criminal or not, tell us the stories about what they're doing, why they're getting on these boats, why they want to get to the UK.
Nicola, a lot of people in this room may think the right-wing press are responsible for fueling perhaps the worst aspects of the media's coverage. But is the danger that, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have a go, metropolitan liberals who come to a private members club on a Monday night in central London perhaps underestimate the concerns of the 110,000 or so people, probably more, who marched in support of Tommy Robinson the other day?
I know from my time at the Home Office that there was a thing called the Daily Mail test, and this continues to this day, where basically the Home Office and Number 10 to a certain extent are trying to court headlines in the tabloids, in the broadcast press as well. But we see this really playing out when it comes to a press conference. We saw it with Reform's press conference today, actually. They sort of cherry pick questions from the main broadcasters, and then they'll just go to the tabloids. They'll go to the right-wing press, and anybody that's sort of from less friendly outlets, let's say, that will sort of issue less favourable coverage for ministers won't be picked. Similarly, when the Home Secretary goes on a trip, nobody from left-leaning outlets, more progressive outlets, will be chosen to go. We saw this with Suella Braverman's trip to Rwanda, where she was laughing sort of manically outside that accommodation they were going to use to house people there that never got used. Money down the drain. But only
the Italians are using it, aren't they?
Oh, really?
I think so.
So only the right-wing press were invited on that trip. GB News, you know, the same people are invited time and time again.
So, Rob, what about public opinion? Do we have a sense of where it actually lies now?
I mean, it's always difficult. It moves quite a lot. And I think that one of the things about public opinion is it depends on how you ask a question, right? So we've done a lot of work over the years looking at what the kind of... So if you say to people, do you want more, less, remain the same with migration? Invariably, you'll get people saying less. But then you ask people a deeper question, which is, well, who are you thinking about? What is the imagined migrant in your head that you would like less of or more of or whatever? You get very, very different answers. And I think... I'm quite keen to just circle back a little bit as well to the question about the role of media in sort of structuring public opinion and making things happen, and also the role of policymakers in doing that, and the symbiotic relationship between policymakers and media and public opinion, this kind of triangular relationship between these three different things, which all influence each other. Because I think that when we think about something like, for example, the Reform Conference today, or Suella Braverman going to Rwanda, or whatever it may be, we need to look at and think about what the role of media has been in feeding the beast, right? And I think that it's really important to understand that, like, we've got to a stage where a good story is perceived to be a story which creates, I think we were talking about this earlier on, this kind of like this big noise, right? So that incentivizes politicians to create radical policy as opposed to create moderate policy. So and that kind of radical policy option is essentially this kind of like, you know, it's a kind of news sugar rush. Oh, look at that, that's exciting, they're saying this, and that's crazy, or that's outrageous, whatever it may be. But what you don't get is the vegetables, right? The things that may be kind of like hard to chew on, but maybe a little bit more kind of like, you know, useful in the long term, you know, realistic in terms of of ensuring long-term health or whatever it may be, right? And I think that media organizations need to seriously think about their place within the ecosystem, and also about how they are essentially fueling the creation of essentially more and more polarized politics by not just, it's by being played, essentially. It is the job of the PR people working for these parties. It's the job of the politicians to create shocking stories that are going to get them on the front page, right? Or that are going to get them on the top of the running order. Now, if media participates in that by not having a different filter, then media is participating in that politics. So we need to think about what is the best way of creating nuanced, rational, reasonable discussions about complex subjects like this.
But Nicola, I'm not sure if you're best placed to answer this. Isn't this as much about algorithms and social media? If you have an outrageous policy, it's great for clickbait. It's great for clips on TikTok or Instagram or whatever.
It's sort of politics by soundbite, though, isn't it? Like we saw it today with the Reform press conference. It's just exhausting. It's every week at least at the moment, and we're 4 years out from a general election. Like, this is only going to continue. It's going to run and run. I think we need to be really cognizant. I totally agree. We need to be really cognizant, and editors in particular, editorial boards and editors need to be really cognizant of the way that they cover this issue. It's really heartening to hear that the BBC are covering it in this way and looking to humanise people. But I think, yes, algorithms have a large part to play in terms of nobody really watches long-form, documentaries anymore. People are sort of looking at like 1 minute sound bites, 1 minute clips that are sort of vertical video friendly, on Instagram, and that's how people are getting their news. And I often think with the sort of death or demise of X, formerly Twitter, that people are being driven even more towards that vertical video 60-second soundbite, and people will are starting already to make policy based on that. And I can sort of hear my former colleagues in the Home Office, Press Office being like, what's the soundbite? So today it would have been this Boris wave. It's just the same message. It'd be one word, a few words, very Trumpian way of messaging. And that's really what the Home Office seems to be going after.
Duna, I don't know, do you look much at social media, and what do you make of what you see?
Yeah, actually, I look so much on social media because of my work, but I just want to talk about an incident about the media and how media can really fuel the public opinion. I don't know if Andrew can remember this. It was, I think, 10 years ago or like 15 years ago. I don't remember exactly. There was an incident, a stabbing incident in one train, and it happened. There was an Iraqi refugee in that train, and they arrested him just because he's an Iraqi refugee. And everything on the media, all the outlets, they were like, the Iraqi refugee was they destroyed his life, literally, and BBC played a crucial role in this, like an Iraqi refugee. They just describe him as Iraqi refugee and see this, like when anything happened, a Muslim woman, an Iraqi refugee, a Syrian refugee. So it turns out that he has nothing to do with the stabbing incident, and he was innocent. And when he was innocent, it was like just not on the front page, not on anything. It's just like, oh, he was innocent. He was not the one who did it. And they just destroyed his life to the extent that he ran away from the UK. He couldn't stay. His picture was everywhere. He's the criminal. So they literally destroyed his life. He left his mother and he ran away. He couldn't stay in the UK. So social media, for me, currently I read some comments, and I literally stopped looking at comments and posts because it made me cry all the time when I look and read how people bring their hate speech. And I ask myself, are you really human to talk about people in this way? It plays a very major role. The way, even if they want to talk about a story, it's different when you put one picture, like the picture that you choose, the headline that you choose, how to portray the story. So it plays a crucial role.
Can I just add? Social media is also the way that the far right organise. So with the Epping Hotel, any riot outside a hotel, this is the way that they're organising. And X, I've been targeted on X most days, and now I just choose not to use it anymore because the vitriol is just so unpleasant, and it just affects people's, and it affects the reporting actually.
Andrew, I could ask you a completely unfair question. I'm not going to, about my rant about the BBC's coverage of the Reform launch this morning, but talk to me about social media.
Well, the point I wanted to make was that smugglers use social media, particularly TikTok Live, as an incredibly efficient way of driving clients towards them with videos, with music, with long interviews, and it's incredibly efficient. And there's a huge marketing campaign that's mostly circles around Iraqi Kurdistan through to Turkey. And yes, it's a very, very efficient way of driving trade.
But does that make you feel a little bit powerless as a traditional journalist?
In the sense that
that there are these this amplification of particular views on X, say, or of the smugglers themselves.
I haven't really thought of it that way. What I do try and do, and my colleagues in particular, are researchers who speak Arabic and Kurdish and so on. They try and reverse engineer the algorithms by actually getting a new phone, a burner phone, putting in the numbers of a few smugglers, and then going on TikTok. The algorithm on TikTok reads your contacts and goes, this person is interested in this. And suddenly you get a treasure trove of material. So that's how I shouldn't be giving away our trade secrets, but anyway.
It's absolutely
going to be onto it. This is how the Home Office
We're all going to go home and brush up on our Kurdish.
Can I just sort of dive in with something for a moment? So one of the things that I'm just quite keen to, I hope I don't get stamped on for this, but we're talking a lot about this as if this is only a problem that involves the right? It's not true. Okay, I mean, at the end of the day, polarization is something which happens in two directions, and simplistic, unrealistic narratives that are generated by the left are just as much of an issue. I mean, maybe not the aggression and the violence of threats and stuff like that, particularly at the moment, but nevertheless, if we want to have a nuanced and reasonable debate about things, it is about both sides working towards finding realistic solutions as opposed to just trying to bash each other and try and win some game with their own audiences, right? And so I'm conscious that the conversation so far has been very driven by this kind of discussion around, isn't it bad that X or Y has happened?
Well, although we've talked about Keir Starmer politicizing events as well.
Sure. But I mean, I think that Keir Starmer even, I mean, is perceived to be way to the right by a lot of people on the left. I mean, the point is that this is something which has got to be this is a complex issue. I mean, we talk about migration as if it's a kind of monolithic thing where, but it's a complex subject, and there are trade-offs and challenges associated with any decision that you make about things. And what we end up with repeatedly, partly as a result of the simplification that you get through social media narratives, is people going, well, just do this and everything will be better. For example, you get we just have safe and legal routes and that'll solve the problems. Or we'll stop all immigration and make everybody leave the country. Neither of which are realistic policy options that are going to solve the problem. You have to have discussions and diplomacy. You have to understand what the trade-offs are and make decisions based on a rational assessment of, well, if we do this, then it's also going to have this impact on public finances, or it's going to have this impact on housing stock, or whatever, and not just present it as if you can click your fingers and solve a problem like that, whether it's from the right or from the left.
Which brings me very neatly, actually, to the question I wanted to round up this part of this evening before I open it up to all of you, which is, what then do you think could be done differently by the media to reflect some of what you've just described?
Okay, it's a complicated one to answer. There's something that nobody's ever going to do, which I like to think could be done. One of the things is to talk less about immigration and migration, right? To not allow yourself to be dragged into a conversation which is designed specifically to stimulate responses from people, which is going to only go one way in terms of the way that it drives policy discussions. If you think that you're going to win the game in this situation by presenting, let's do lots of nice positive counter narratives, what you're actually going to do is drive public awareness of the issue, and that is going to also stimulate lots of negative responses. So talking less about immigration would be a massive win if you want nuanced policy, whether now, how to do that is difficult. It's also entirely counterproductive for me, because my role sort of talking about migration the whole time would be undermined somewhat. Nevertheless, I think it's a major problem. We've allowed ourselves to see a complex issue as something simple that you can solve and that you can just talk about and try and win.
But I would counter that and say that is an agenda that's been driven by politicians since around 2015, 2014, since before Brexit.
The talk about immigration.
Let's keep talking about migration.
It generates benefits for a certain sort of set of outcomes. If you want to stress people out, talk about immigration a lot. Well, I'll tell you a little thing that happened. Okay, so after the referendum, my phone rang off the hook for a year and a half, 2 years before the referendum. Migration was massively at the top of the public concerns. If you looked at the Ipsos Mori Issues Index, it was always either number one or around the sort of like the top issues for people. And the day after the referendum, my phone stopped ringing, right? Not completely, but broadly, my phone stopped ringing. And there was very, very little interest from people in the issue of migration, because the debate at that point in time, I mean, there was obviously a lot of discussion about refugees and the Syrian issue and all this kind of stuff, but actually, fundamentally, the discussion was about net migration and about people coming in large numbers from the EU. And the perception was, well, jobs are good and it's all been solved now. And so nobody called for a long time, and actually for quite a while, very little was reported in the press. There was a massive decline in the number of stories about migration. And by 2019, the Pew Charitable Trust did some analysis looking at the OECD countries and attitudes towards migration. Is migration a net positive or a net negative for your country? And across all of those OECD countries, if you look at the European ones, the UK was the one that was most positive about the value of migration, right? And that's after 3 years of people shutting up about migration. Not completely, but largely, right? And I think that that's one of the things. If you put something at the top of the policy and media agenda, people get stressed about it, right? Naturally, because you're presented with the idea, here is a problem, we need to do something about it, right? And naturally, people are like, well, what are we going to do about it? Send everybody home, open safe and legal routes, whatever it may be, right? But the reality is that actually media and public and policymakers are the people who are setting the public agenda, right? No, but they are. I mean, like public opinion.
I would say that politicians. I'm sorry, I'm getting into this argument. I think politicians have a big part to play.
No, I agree. That's what I'm saying. Media and policymakers, public attitudes as well, which feed into. I mean, it's that triangle again, right?
Yeah.
It's that. But the thing is that the role that everybody in this room can play is the bit which involves placing a little bit of a brake on the bit that the media does. So instead of amplifying the speed and frustration that everything zooms around that thing, it can calm down. Anyway, I obviously need to shut up, sorry.
It's a conversation we have to carry on. I have lots of thoughts about this. Nicola, what do you think is the one thing that could perhaps at least turn this conversation into something more constructive than perhaps it's felt, certainly this summer and even last summer, thinking about it?
Manage airtime. I think we see reform. I mean, we see Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Zia Youssef. You know, we see Lee Anderson to a certain extent. We see the same people every day on our broadcast news. We, you know, by the same token, we don't see Zach Polanski on primetime news. Like the day after he was elected as leader of the Greens, with the same number of seats as Reform have, he wasn't on the Today programme. Richard Tice was. We need to be really, really mindful of who we're giving airtime to, because, you know, we saw it today with this Reform press conference. They just ran it, every broadcaster, and The Guardian Live did it as well. They ran the entire press conference, all the questions afterwards. Zach Polanski's just on social media platforms. Again, the same number of seats. We need to be mindful of that. I would say as well, people, most outlets could employ somebody who was a specialist, and that would completely change the way that this issue is covered. So it wasn't just Westminster bubble focusing on who's up, who's down, you know, what's going on in Westminster. So you can send someone to be out and about across the country, understanding on the beaches in northern France, you know, outside these hotels, you know, staying with communities over time to understand the changes that are happening. There is so much to gain from having someone on the ground, someone that's consistently following these issues, that understands the system, not just the politics. So I think employing specialists in newsrooms would be a very good use of budget, but I'm not
Andrew, I'd like to think you are that person, but what would you like to see?
Well, I'm going to do a lot less. No, I don't disagree, and I worry about the way we cover this. And in fact, we don't do very many reports. What we try and do are much longer, less frequent, not sensational, often investigative reports. The trouble is TV in particular is a very blunt medium. People remember images. They worm their way into people's brains. People misinterpret them. Despite what you may say and scream and shout, people will see what they want to see. But yes, when we look back on this era, will this story of the small boats be the defining era of our time, or will it be Ukraine? I think one problem is, as well, we've been covering it for 25 years. When I arrived in Paris just 2 years ago, everybody there was going, oh God, not Calais, we've got to go to Calais again. It's the same story. I have colleagues a generation ago who were covering this story. So the constant search for new ways to tell the story, because that's what you do as journalists. And luckily, that's what the smugglers keep doing, finding new ways to beat the police. So just when you think, well, no one's going to be interested in small boats crossing again because that's just what happens and it's very incrementally hard to make a big difference. Suddenly there's taxi boats, there's something new. And it's very hard not to keep covering those changes.
Do now, what would you like to see changed?
Other than changing the language and the terminology, instead of a burden, instead of like crowded and wave, like we use the contributions, we use the resilience. I echo the idea of like talking less about refugees, because although we haven't reached the time where there is positive discrimination. Like I find sometimes, like as a refugee, I'm being positive discriminated when they talk too much. Like anything I do, they want to show that I'm doing something good. But like anything I do, they just like, this is something normal. Any human being can do. But like, no, as a refugee, she ate a breakfast, for example. So no, I'm a human being. I can do anything. So sometimes this is positive discrimination. Other than that, actually, maybe we can just define what hate speech is. I still remember when the Ukrainian refugees came to the UK, and I was watching on TV saying that they are not refugees, they are Christians, they have blue eyes, they are white. So this is hate speech. This is hate speech. So how come in a country it really values the humans, like people are being discriminated of their color or their background, their religion. And in one event I was organizing for an organization which the cause of the organization was refugees, and I was there, and a Ukrainian refugee, she went to the stage and she said that, please don't describe us as refugees. We are not refugees, so this is an offense. So the CEO of the organization, she apologized for her and she said, sorry, we are not offending you, you are not refugees. So I was like, the word refugee is not an offense, so we are refugees as well, and you work for refugees, so how come? So I just feel like people, they don't have the education yet, they don't get themselves educated, and I understand that some people, they don't want to bother and read about it, but when you work in this field, you should get some, like the minimum amount of education about those words. Like when you say in front of a refugee that the word refugee is an offense, and don't describe someone as refugee because you are offending them. So this is really horrible. So maybe we define the hate speech, we define what is the hate speech, we define like how we don't offend people. And also I talked about changing the language, try to change the language, and hiring people with like knowledge and experience.
Great, thank you.
And using the NCTJ reporting migration course, yeah?
Actually,
I'm gonna open it up to the floor, if I may. So, some questions from the floor. There's a lady at the front here with the blue. Hang on, wait for the microphone. And if you can keep your questions relatively brief or make a point, then we can get through as many as possible.
My name is Sarah, and I chair a refugee charity. You started the conversation with defining what migration actually is and saying only 5% are the boats, but the whole media coverage, every single thing is always about migration, conflated. And if you ask the average person in the street, they probably tell you there's 650,000 of them every year. Why did you focus only on asylum seekers and that horrible rhetoric? I'm sorry, the media is a hell of a lot to blame, because every single day they conflate this every single day. There is conversation about these 27,000 people who come every year. And instead, what they really talk about, and reform will talk about migration, all migration. Why did you only
I hope I tried to bring that out at the very beginning.
I know, but you did try it, but
Yeah.
ultimately...
But I think isn't that the nature? I'm going to slightly defend myself here. I think I absolutely agree with you, and I think that's why it's really important to look at the difference between the numbers of people coming in small boats and looking at overall migration and the way in which those numbers have been weaponized, let's say.
So the media has a huge role to play to actually, but they don't want to. I think the media is so polarized today, they should play the role of actually defining that properly.
Can I? So I think something that's interesting in this is, so a former colleague of mine at Oxford, a woman called Bridget Anderson, who's now in Bristol, who's a totally brilliant scholar, wrote a really good book called Us and Them, The Dangerous Politics of Immigration Control. And one of the key points that she makes is that all immigration policy, pretty much everywhere in the world, is focused on restricting the mobility of the poor, right? That's essentially what migration policy is there to do, right? We don't really have migration policy which is designed to prevent Premiership football players from coming to the UK and playing for London football clubs, right? So, and I think the crux of this challenge is that at the end of the day, the mobility of people, people crossing the channel are essentially likely to be or presumed to be destitute, and they're presumed to be therefore costly for the state. They're presumed, and it's also a symbol of a perceived lack of control, right? And so these are all things which make easy storytelling for media organizations, and it's also something to focus on as a component of a broken system. And the job of journalism often is to expose things that are flawed and broken. So these are complicated things to get to manage. There isn't a straightforward answer to it. I mean, I agree with you, that conflation happens all the time. It's frustrating. But the other question is, well, that's the bit of the system that people see as not working. Whereas, I mean, sorry. Well, no. But that's what I mean. Like, journalists tell stories because they sell stories, right? I mean, but I think that. I mean, we saw a lot about, I mean, up until 2016, there was a huge amount of focus on net migration that was not really to do with refugees and asylum seekers. I mean, a year ago, when we had net migration spiking at pushing 1 million, the focus was quite significantly on that. The thing about the refugee issue, the thing about the Calais issue and small boat crossings is it fundamentally brings spectacle. It's very visible. In the days when people were arriving primarily in the backs of lorries, you couldn't take a photograph of it. The change in the strategy of smugglers and the change in the strategy to move from the clandestine arrivals in the back of lorries to small boats has been about actually also being intercepted. It's all about actually joining the asylum system, and that makes a big difference to the opportunity to tell stories. You've got new pictures every day, big loaded boat, tell that story. So I agree, you're right. I mean, it's conflated, it's problematic, but the bit that is the big number, the people that are coming on visas to work in the NHS or that are coming to join family members or coming to be international students, aren't perceived to be problematic in the way that people arriving without legal rights.
Although I would contend, which I think is going to, they're becoming problematic because of the narrative.
This whole narrative is about problems for migration in totality.
Sure.
Okay.
But politics, there's a play into that, though, because consecutive governments have had a policy of net migration because we need it. But so in order for you to, if you got rid of, I'll look at another, you got rid of the boats, right? 30,000 people stopped coming. Do you think the issue of migration will stop becoming a headline?
I'm going to ask you to pause so I can get just a few more questions in, but I absolutely think you make a very valid point. Right, there was a gentleman just behind you.
Yes, I'd like to pick up what Robert and Nicola was saying about, there's just too much coverage driven by politicians and media. And I think that's supported by a very interesting piece just in this last weekend's FT, which was looking at, if you ask general public to rank the issues facing the country, migration is number one. If you ask them about the issues facing themselves, it's about number 6. And I think that illustrates that this issue has simply been overexposed by our politicians and media, and, as you say, with a huge skew towards some of the loudest and most strident voices, even on broadcast, never mind social media,
Now,
being given too much airtime.
there's another question here, but I'm going to take one. I'll speak to you, and then I'll take that one right at the back there, so I feel like I've covered the room. So speak, if you can give it to this lady here, and then I'll take the person at the back over there. Yeah.
Mine follows on from what this gentleman said, and it being overinflated. I was listening to the Today programme the other day, and the reporter said, small boats is the biggest issue facing this country. And I thought, how can she say that as a journalist? It's not. But, you know, and I was going to complain, but I didn't get around to it. But I wonder if the BBC is having discussions on the language that they're using and how, you know, how.
Andrew, I mean, it's not easy to be the defender of the BBC, but I mean, are there editorial discussions about the level of coverage?
There are. I know there have been a lot of sort of long-term investigations into how we cover, the language we use, and yes, I agree with you all in terms of the balance, and that I think speaks often to the power of the visual image, as opposed to the facts of how migration is occurring, and getting the balance right and getting the right kind of coverage of migration is not something that I think we've nailed at all.
Nicola, do you ever feel, I hate to use the word, but complicit?
Maybe not complicit.
Well, in a sense of, if we're talking about overexposure, you know, in a sense, we're almost saying it doesn't matter what the story is.
I am really mindful of covering immigration and asylum as two separate issues that are very closely linked. The Home Office sort of separate them in terms of illegal and legal migration. I've done, I would say, as much reporting on the beaches on the Kent coast and in northern France, and the dispersal system and the failings there in terms of asylum hotels and other aspects of the system, as I have shadowing a care worker at a care home in Scarborough or cycling around after a Deliveroo rider. So I'm really mindful of making sure that I'm not complicit and that many different aspects of the system are covered and that we get lots of different voices out there.
Sorry, I knew it was not an entirely fair word.
Can I contribute to this,
Yes.
please? So just going back to the BBC point, so it's not only about refugees or how they like the terminology they use in describing refugees. As Syrian, when I was living here, actually I still live here, so before the Syrian regime, Assad regime falls down in Syria, I used to read the BBC and I used to see how they describe the Syrian regime and how, like, sometimes I used to, the chemical weapons that happened in Ghouta, they describe people who died, innocent people who died in Ghouta, terrorists. And they described Assad as the president of Syria, although many other outlets they didn't like, they just said Assad. They still did describe him as the president, the legal president of Syria, although he was not legal, he was a terrorist himself, he was killing people. So they talk about refugees and they hate refugees and they hate migrants. Okay, if you hate migrants, stop fueling the person who's causing the migration, who's causing that. Like, stop the reason. You are glorifying the criminal, and at the same time, you are talking about the cause, the problem, without talking about the roots of the problem.
I know Andrew would agree with us that language like that is discussed and argued over kind of quite intensively, isn't it? About at what point do you use the word regime, and what point do you how do you describe a slightly a very compromised leader?
Indeed. I spent 18 years living in Africa and coming back to London and having very long, very difficult conversations about the extent to which we covered Africa negatively, the language we used, what we focused on, what we didn't focus on, how we gave a rounded picture. And it is the same with this issue. And though we don't always get it right, that does not mean we're, a lot of well-intentioned and intelligent people are not discussing this and agonizing over this, and would appreciate, I think, more contributions from all of you, even though they might not always reply to to everything. But
Can I defend the BBC for a second? Sorry, am I allowed to do that?
Yes, you are. I was kind of hoping I was sort of doing that just then.
But no, the BBC, right, there's plenty wrong with the BBC's coverage of migration. There's plenty wrong with everybody's coverage of migration. It's not as if... but the BBC at least reflects on this stuff, right? The BBC thinks about it. So one of the things, like two years ago, the BBC did a massive thematic review of migration coverage. I know this because it was done by Madeleine Sumption, who's my boss, and I was sort of vaguely involved in sort of pushing her towards doing it because I thought it was a good thing to do. But that took a really deep dive. And again, I mean, just without meaning to sort of point fingers at the sort of, what you described as the sort of cosmopolitan, metropolitan elite or whatever it may be. Like, we all talk about it as if the presumption is that the BBC is, like shockingly right-wing about this kind of stuff. Honestly speaking, one of the big challenges is also that the BBC will commonly skew to the left on the issue as well. And that's one of the major criticisms from the rest of the country about it again. So I think it's really important that, and the overall conclusion was, it's not perfect, but it does walk a challenging line and tries its best there. Yeah, go on.
This is very, very stable data.
Sure.
Okay, YouGov data, and that is that if, in answer to the neutral question, do you believe the BBC's news coverage is systematically skewed to the left, skewed to the right, or neither, consistently 20% agree with the Daily Mail that it's systematically skewed to the left. 20% systematically say it's skewed to the right.
Yeah.
The middle 60% either say it's neutral or say I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly the point. It struggles.
I'm suggesting that around the country,
Right.
a majority of people will say
Okay.
the BT has a
Sure, no, that's right. That's fair enough. That's a fair point.
I want to take one more point before we have to wrap up, and I promised that lady over there that I would come to her.
Hi, thank you so much. We've had a lot of conversations about this big media blob, and I think a lot of the advice you've given are to what would be considered by editors in a newsroom, hiring specialists, for example. But as a reporter on the ground, you're working for a paper with a particular political view. Your paper is driven by clicks. What's your advice for a reporter on the ground who isn't a specialist, perhaps? Where do we start? Where do we start with reporting on this issue?
NCTJ, reporting migration.
I'm a specialist, by the way, by background.
Nicola, how do you handle it? How do you handle the bias that you encounter when you turn up with your pitch?
I often think I sort of operate within an echo chamber by only working for particular outlets where I agree with their editorial stance on this issue, because it's important to me and I specialise within it. So yeah, sort of question your editors on what angle they're going to, they want to take, what stance they're going to take on that particular issue. Oh God, it's such a difficult question. It's a very good question, but I'm not sure I've got an answer. If anyone else does, sorry.
Very briefly, Rob.
Okay, I did analysis in 2016-17, which was looking at why does migration coverage look like it does in different countries, which specifically looked at and which delved into the question of it was basically about how do people work when they're reporting migration. We interviewed 200 and something journalists around Europe, right? And the answer to the question of what do you do about it was, is very, very difficult because there isn't a straightforward answer. But one of the things that was important is to remember that you do have agency as a journalist. You can push back. You can tell. If you've got to be strong, because I worked in a newsroom for a long time where dissent was not really considered to be something that was permitted. But if you don't push back, who the hell will? Right? If you think that something is fundamentally wrong and your newspaper is pushing it in that direction, push back against it as best you can. You won't win every game, but you're going to nudge things in the right direction. And one of the biggest challenges was that people wrote for an imagined version of their editor, right? So they weren't writing for... The editor wasn't coming in and saying, you've got to do it this way. But they imagined what their editor wanted, and they usually made it cartoonish, right? They usually made it much less nuanced. And the outcome of that is cartoonish coverage, right? So one of the things you can do is push back. The other thing is the NCTJ reporting migration.
Yeah. Right, I am going to wrap up there. I'm so sorry. It's been fantastic, brilliant questions, but we have crashed the pips. We have run well over time. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our fantastic panel, Rob, Nicola, Andrew, Duna. Really brilliant to hear from you all. We can carry on the conversation in the bar and we can all get everything off our chests. I've got plenty more I'd like to say too. Thank you all very much for coming.